Norma, can you hear me? Norma?
Hi, I just unmuted. Good morning.
Norma, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Kathy. Good morning.
Oh,
Can you hear
good
me?
morning. I had to turn my volume up. I had it way down.
Okay, that works. Doing
I don't
okay?
know. Pardon?
Are you doing okay?
I'm doing fine.
So are we.
Had a good weekend. Nice long weekend.
You know, when you're retired, it just all runs together.
Yeah.
Especially now with COVID, we don't do as many things. So one day is just
Yeah.
like the other. Oh, while I've got you, Is it okay if maybe a couple of us come into the garden next week to finish up what we didn't get done the other day? I
Sure.
know we need to trim that wild lime tree back before any visitors come in the garden, and we didn't get that done.
Mhm.
And there's other things I want to do. Do you
Yeah.
need to know what day we're coming, or can we just show up? We'll only be in the.
You can just come. It should be fine. I mean,
Yeah, we'll only be in the butterfly garden part of it.
okay.
Thank you.
Do you see my picture, Norma?
Yes, I see your picture.
Okay.
I also see the presentation.
Because I see you there, but I don't see myself, so I'm not sure what's going on.
Yeah, you're showing in the corner. You're not full screen. The
Yeah.
presentation is full screen, and you're in the corner.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Welcome. We'll be getting started in a few minutes. Are you seeing my control panel, or are you seeing the full, just the screen, the presentation screen?
I'm seeing the
Presentation screen.
presentation screen, and it shows
Okay.
you in the corner.
Right, okay, but you don't see like my video camera and
No.
participants, that control panel.
Mhm.
That's good, because it's a little in the way.
Yeah, that's because you got the recording option on.
Yes. We have a few people coming in, and we'll get started in a few minutes. Welcome. Good morning, everyone. There is a chat. If you have questions, you can put questions in the chat box, and I'll try to get to them at various points during the presentation, or I may just wait till the end, depending on how time is going. We are recording this meeting and this webinar so that you can go back and review it. And just to let you know, we are recording. And once we get started, if you could please mute your microphone, I would appreciate that. Okay, well, we're at 11 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kathy Oliver, and I'm a program assistant with Manatee County Extension Service. We are the Extension Service. If you're not familiar with us, we are a cooperative organization between the University of Florida and county government. So every county in Florida has an extension service for disseminating information to the community based on research that occurs at the university level. This is the first of our webinar series on organic gardening, and our focus is on vegetable gardening. Next week, Monday, at 11 o'clock, we will have Mac Lessig with us, and he is going to be discussing pests and diseases. And then the next Monday after that, September 20th, Dr. Angela Fritz, who is on the call with us today, she will be going over veggies for health, so nutrition and healthy eating and recipes with your organic veggies. So if you have any questions as we go along, go ahead and put your questions in the chat, and I will try to get to them at the end. And I'm going to start off with an introduction to organic gardening, prepping, and planning. So let's see, why is my slide not advancing? Well, okay. Organic gardening basically is a way of gardening that combines basic gardening procedures with an ethical philosophy of environmental preservation. And people have different reasons for getting into organic gardening. It could be because they're concerned about the environment or their health, or they want to engage more in regenerative agriculture and improving soils, or they just want to avoid synthetic chemicals and pesticides. So what I'd like to do now, I'm going to launch a poll to see what is your main motivation for wanting to practice organic gardening? And I did just allow you one answer in this, but I know you probably have a few different reasons for engaging in organic gardening. So let me show the results of the poll here. So half of you are wanting to do it for health reasons, avoiding synthetics, and protecting natural resources. Oh, so here's the results. So our objectives today, and basically many of the objectives for organic gardening are identifying natural and organic materials and avoiding synthetic and man-made chemicals, using biological, cultural, mechanical methods to cultivate plants, and avoiding practices that are harmful to the environment and to our health, and promoting ecological balance and conserving biodiversity and natural resources. And even in commercial organics, an organic producer's farm plan does include ecological balance, conserving biological diversity. So it's not just a philosophy, it's something that is actually put into practice both commercially and in the home garden. Organic gardening is also compatible with all of the Florida-friendly landscaping principles and integrated pest management, which will be discussed next week. So with organic gardening, the emphasis is on soil management. The health of the soil really is the foundation of organic gardening. Soil building is the way that you are able to get nutrients to your plant. Most of it is through adding organic matter to the soil, and that will enhance the soil biodiversity. All the microorganisms that are breaking down the organic matter are releasing nutrients for your plants to use. And you want to maintain soil health, good soil structure, a soil that is healthy will retain water and retain nutrients, because nutrients flow with the water. So that is going to be the basis of your gardening. And the next step is using cultural management. And this is mainly to prevent problems from occurring in the first place. So you want to think about selecting suitable varieties, locating your garden in the right place and under conditions that the plants are going to thrive, and proper watering, other management issues, fertilizing, and pruning, all these things. And we'll talk a lot about crop rotation as well as a basic cultural practice in organic gardening. The whole thing is to prevent stress to your plants and keeping them healthy so that they can fight off any pests or diseases or other problems. Because the last step to take is curative, or trying to cure problems with, of course, in organic gardening, we use natural products and organic products for pest control. So, but still, just because the products are natural. It doesn't mean that they are entirely safe. There are some products that are toxic to humans that are come from nature, and also that are toxic to the beneficial insects and pollinators that you want to encourage in your garden. So curative measures are generally the last step that you want to move to. We have to learn to tolerate some damage. If there's a small level of damage or an acceptable level of damage where your plants are still producing, then perhaps you want to just leave it alone and let nature take its course. We also, when we buy seeds or transplants, we look for organically grown plants, and also untreated seeds, which means that there are no fungicides applied to the seed coat. And it will say on the seed packet if it has been treated with fungicides. And you'll also notice when you look at the seeds that they're a bright blue or pink color. So you will know that the fungicides are present so that you don't handle them. But in organic gardening, we use untreated seed. So growing in Central Florida, we're very lucky that we can grow year round, maybe not every single thing. And you have to be strategic about the plants that you grow in the summertime. They have to be adapted to our heat and humidity and still be able to produce for you. Fall, winter, and spring are really our best seasons for growing. We're kind of flip-flopped from the northern climates. And commercially, Florida does produce about 25% of the nation's produce. And we are growing when a lot of other states can't. Some of the problems that we have to deal with, however, are infertile soils. We have very sandy soils, and they're generally quite low in organic matter. And remember, organic matter is where a lot of your fertility is coming from. So it often takes several years to increase the organic matter, and it requires additions each year. So it's important to remember one of the Florida-friendly principles, which is planting the right plant in the right place. And I've added in there at the right time. So how do you know what is the right time to plant your vegetables? Well, the University of Florida has a great Florida vegetable gardening guide that you can get online. And it has some wonderful charts in there listing the crops, the planting dates for the area that you were in, and some very important information for planting, like spacing, how far to place your rows, seed depth. And one of the important ones is transplantability, which indicates whether you can grow plants from seed into transplants and then move them into your garden, or is it better to just direct seed right into the garden? And another important column that I want to point out here is the plant family. And this is important when you get into crop rotation, because you want to plant a different plant family in the space. Each time you want to rotate to a different plant family, and we will discuss that. There's also a great online app that was just newly developed. It's the Florida Fresh app. And when you go to that, you enter your zip code and it will tell you what to plant by month. And on each of the list of veggies that come up, you can click on those, and it will give you cultivation information about each plant. So it's a really handy online app. And UF has some other gardening resources as well, which I've put here. The organic vegetable gardening in Florida is a companion guide to the Florida Vegetable Gardening Guide. So they kind of go hand in hand with some specific information in the organic vegetable gardening. So when you're getting started, planning is important. You want to think about what you're going to grow and what's going to grow well here at this time, at the correct season that you'll be planting. So this is where the Florida Vegetable Gardening Guide really comes in handy. It's a good idea to draw the layout of your garden, and including what you're going to plant where and when. And some plants you want to think about planting in successive plantings. Some that are very fast growing, like radishes, lettuces, even herbs like cilantro, which is very fast growing. You may want to plant those out every 2 or 3 weeks from seed, so that you have a continual harvest long throughout the season. And drawing the garden layout really does help you rotate crops, because you have a record of what you planted in the garden, where it was planted, so that you can move to a different plant family in that area of the garden. It's a good idea to make a list of supplies, seeds, transplants you might want to buy. Transplants especially can be a little hard to source if you're looking for organics. So, you know, you have to do a little research. Seeds are generally fairly readily available, organic seeds. I've seen them even at big box stores and, you know, garden centers, but they kind of come and go. But you can find a lot of organic seeds through mail order catalogs or on the internet. So you're going to create a timeline and keep records to help you year to year know what's working well and what you want to move to in the next season. My mouse is a little sensitive. So crop rotation, let's talk about that a little bit. As I mentioned, it is changing the location of crops within the garden area. So you would rotate to a completely different plant family. And remember, the plant families are listed in the Florida Vegetable Gardening Guide. And the advantages of crop rotation is that it breaks the life cycle of diseases and pests. A lot of pests and diseases are, you know, host specific. So they like members of a certain plant family and not of another. And nematodes are especially important in this regard. Nematodes are tiny little worms that burrow into the roots of certain plants that are susceptible to nematodes. So they're very difficult to treat. And crop rotation is one of the management strategies for discouraging nematodes. Nematodes live in the soil and they're everywhere. So they are something you will probably be dealing with at some point. Also, plants of different families use nutrients differently. They may use one nutrient more than another, or they may add nutrients. In the case of legumes like beans and peas, they are called nitrogen fixers. So they can actually take nitrogen from the air and form, nitrogen has some forms that are not usable by plants. So the legumes can convert it to a usable form. So they can actually add nitrogen to your garden area. And you can see in this bed, about half the bed is planted in what looks like brassicas, the Brassicaceae, the cabbage or mustard family, I think. So we've got mustard greens and collards, it looks like. So the next year you'd want to stay away from any members of that plant family in this area of the garden. You might move to plants in the Solanaceae. Those would be like tomatoes or peppers or potatoes. So those are all in the Solanaceae family, the nightshade family. And you can kind of plan it out. Sometimes you can plan, 2 to 5 years in advance. So this example down here at the bottom shows a garden that's been split up into 5 areas, and the families are noted for each area, so that when you move on to season 2, you're planting different families in those areas. So this is a really important point to remember. But how do you know? I wanted to give you a little example of the commonly planted vegetables and their families for our area. And it might surprise you that I know I was surprised to learn that all these brassica type plants, arugula, turnip, mustard, are all related. They're basically all developed from one type of plant. So they're all in the same family. Another thing to think about in plant selection is hardiness zones. So what plants are adapted to our cold weather? And there's even heat zones. But generally, when we're planting in the fall, winter, and spring, we're concerned with minimum temperatures. So Florida has about 6 or 7 different zones, plant hardiness zones. This is developed by the USDA. We're in Manatee County, just above Sarasota here, and along our coastline, we're zone 10A, but when you get more towards the east of the county, then we're in 9B. And so our average minimum temperatures are going to be 30 to 35 degrees, 25 to 30 degrees in 9B. And you, a lot of catalogs where you purchase seeds or plants will tell you what the hardiness zone is. Usually it's a range, say 8 to 11. So you want to select plants that are suited for our hardiness zone. Here in Florida, we kind of divide our veggies into warm season and cool season veggies. So here in September, we're getting towards the end of the summer season. We're going to start planting our warm season veggies. And because our first frost date is generally around December 15th. That is changing a bit. It seems like we don't get frost till around Christmas now. But when you get, when your warm season plants get too chilled, then of course you're going to have damage, and injury can occur at temperatures. If it occurs suddenly, when they drop below 50 degrees, you could get chilling injury. It also affects the fruit set and pollination and the growth of the plant when warm season plants are grown in too cold of weather. On the other hand, when you plant cool season plants at the wrong time, when it's too warm, well, you have problems like premature flowering and seeding, so they bolt and they get bitter flavors. Lettuces especially are this way. They get bitter once the weather's too warm and they're starting to go to seed, and it's really pretty undesirable flavors. So this is another way to give you an idea of what's in season when. This is when vegetables are being harvested in Florida. You can see, let's look at September right now. Carambola, yes, the trees are loaded. That's fruits. A lot of citrus is starting to come in. Mango, citrus, passion fruit, peanut. You can see in September, we don't have a lot of vegetables being harvested because we're kind of in between seasons. The very hot, we're transitioning to the warm season veggies, and probably about October is when you would start planting your cool season vegetables. When you're buying seeds and transplants, again, you want to look for organically grown. Looking online is a great place to find organic seeds, and sometimes locally, as I mentioned. Transplants are a little bit more difficult, so you may want to think about growing plants from seed yourself and then transplanting them into the garden. And when you do that, you really can find a lot more variety of cultivars and different types of veggies that you can grow when you grow them from seed, rather than having to depend on what's locally available in box stores or feed stores or elsewhere. We do not use GMO, genetically modified seeds. So that's important to look for when you're shopping for seeds. And again, no treated seeds, no fungicides applied to the seeds before planting. There are inoculants that you can buy for legumes, and these are beneficial rhizobial bacteria, nitrogen fixing bacteria that are associated with legumes. And those are okay because the rhizobium is natural. If you're using potting mixes to grow your own transplants from seed, you want to look for a mix that has no wetting agents in it. This is a synthetic product that absorbs water and keeps the soil moister. But again, it's synthetic, so you don't want that in your potting mix, and no synthetic fertilizers. There are some mixes that will have organic fertilizers in them, and that's okay. We don't use hormones or antibiotics, so things like rooting hormone are not used in organic gardening. When you're looking for seeds, you want to think about choosing disease-resistant varieties. And on this seed packet here, you can see the variety is Roma, and it says VFN after it. And that means that the variety is resistant to verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, and nematodes. And so these are very, kind of prevalent diseases in tomatoes. So buying resistance in the variety will help you definitely in the long run with your growing and your success. Now, resistance does not always mean that it's immune to these diseases, but it does indicate that the plant will still produce despite, showing signs of the disease. When you, it is good to use fresh seed if possible. You can store seeds for up to a year, and with some plants, the seeds store really well, and you can keep them longer as long as they're stored in a cool, dry place. The refrigerator is okay for your seeds, not the freezer. So store your seeds to keep them as fresh as possible. And if you're wanting to save your seeds from your garden and plant them again next year, then you would want to use open pollinated or heirloom varieties. These varieties have very stable genetics, and as long as they're not cross-pollinated or cross-pollinated with some different varieties, generally they pollinate themselves and they come true from seed. This is not the case for hybrids. Hybrids are relatively recent crosses between two parents to have desirable characteristics, especially disease resistance. And they do not come true from seed because they are very recent crosses. So you may get characteristics of one parent mixed with another, and it's not the same as the fruit that you harvested. When you're starting your garden, you've got to think about what is a good site for the garden. So you want to choose a place that has full sun. That's like 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight. That's very important for your flowering and fruit producing vegetables like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, vegetative type vegetables like lettuces and greens and root crops. They can get away with a little bit less sun, maybe 5 to 6 hours, not much less. So you want to think about also orienting your beds or your rows north to south. In that way, when the sun rises in the east and moves to the west, you get an equal amount of sunlight on all the plants. If you orient your rows east to west, you can get shading at all parts of the day. Some of the plants will be shaded by the others. Especially in the winter when the sun is kind of slanted to the south of us. It's important to think about heights of plants, and I'll get into that a little later. Locate your garden near a water source. You're going to need water. You don't want to really drag hoses for long distances. So you want to be near a water source. And drip or micro irrigation is really recommended as a method for conserving water. And it also improves the health of your plants to have the water directed at the roots and not on the leaves, because that can promote diseases when the leaves stay wet. And drip irrigation uses about 35% less water than overhead sprinklers, and it's placed right where the roots need it. When plants are young, you'll want to water a little more frequently and shallower. And when they're established, you can go to probably once a week on the watering, about 3/4 to an inch per week. And of course, if you have rainfall, then you can cut back on your irrigation. Reclaimed water is something that should only be used on vegetables that are cooked before eating. So that's according to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. That is their recommendation. And a lot of veggies are eaten raw. So it's probably best to stay away from reclaimed water on your edibles. And rain barrels also are not suitable. Rain water from barrels. The rain comes off the roof and it can pick up toxins from the roof and bird droppings and algae. So that's fine for your ornamentals, but you don't want to use that on your edibles. Of course, you're going to be digging in the ground, so stay away from utility lines, septic, roots, tree roots, that especially oaks that send up shoots into, from their roots. They're tricky to deal with. So, and of course you want the sun, so you're not going to be too close to trees. You want a well-drained location. Veggies they like moisture, but they don't want to sit in water. So if their roots are wet continuously, that's not going to work. You also want to determine what size of garden can you deal with. It can be very labor intensive to garden organically. So if you're a beginner, you may want to start small. Something like a 4 by 8 foot plot is great. 4 feet is about maximum width that you would want for, say, a raised bed, because then you can still reach over into the middle from the side at about 4 feet. If you're more ambitious, you can go for a larger size, and you may want to think about using multiples of 100 square feet, something like 4 by 25, because a lot of your soil amendments and fertilizers are based on 100 square foot measurements. So that just makes the calculations a little easier. So here's some examples. Mostly in Florida, we don't worry too much about the raised beds, and though they do have their advantages in that it provides more depth for the roots, and it defines the rows so you know where to walk. But you don't need to do beds. You can just, smooth the soil flat and define your rows in some other way. Hills are used for crops that need a lot of space, that have a viney growth, such as pumpkins and squashes and melons. They're planted in what's called hills. And this is so that you can plant 4 or 6 plants in one location, and then they have a lot of room around them to spread out. And that way you're only putting your fertilizer and your water on the hill and not onto the entire garden, which can promote a lot of weeds if you're watering and fertilizing the entire garden. Raised beds are great, and this raised bed example here in the bottom left has a nice little fence around it to keep some of the critters out, like rabbits, or well, this one wouldn't work for deer, but you may have to fence your garden if you have deer in your area. I have gopher tortoises that munch on my lettuces, but I don't mind it. Another example here is a square foot garden, and the bed is divided into 1 foot squares. And this way you utilize the entire space of the garden. You have no rows, but you see it's only about 4 feet wide. So again, you can reach in and access all areas of the garden. And then the number of plants that you put in each square depends on how large the plants are. So large plants like tomatoes or cabbages would only have 1 per square. Greens like lettuce or bok choy, or just sort of not so large plants would have about 4 in the square. Medium plants would have about 12 in the square. And small plants like radishes and carrots, you could plant 16 in a 1 foot square. So it's a very efficient use of space. So let's talk a little bit about soil. Remember, it's the foundation of organic gardening, and you want a soil that is vibrant and alive. So it's full of not only minerals like sand in our case, but also water and air, because your plants, as well as all these microorganisms in the soil, need air and water to survive. So healthy soil is about 5% organic matter. And remember, I said in Florida, we have about average 1.5% organic matter. So you want to keep adding organic matter to try and build up to that goal of 5%. It takes many, many years if your soil is very sandy. And of course, organic matter gets used up, it gets volatilized if exposed to the air. So it's always disappearing from soils. That's why you need to add organic matter every year. And organic matter does include all these microorganisms, the invertebrates, the fungi, the bacteria, the worms, and all the different plant material that's found in soil is what comprises organic matter. Air is very important in soil. A lot of people are surprised that there's so much air, but it's very important because that allows for water flow and nutrients flow with the water as well. And it promotes root growth as well. When you have compacted soils, the air spaces are very small and it's much more difficult for roots to grow. So that's all just part of the soil structure. Organic matter, of course, is anything plant material based or animal material like manure. It has many, many benefits to our sandy soils here in Florida. It improves the soil's ability to retain water and nutrients. It improves the structure. It provides slow release nutrients. So as the microorganisms work on it, it's releasing nutrients over time. And it will help increase your beneficial microbial life in your soil. Organic matter also suppresses nematodes because there are beneficial microbes that attack nematodes and destroy them. So the more organic matter you have, the more beneficials you have working for you. So organic matter is an important indicator of soil quality. And if you don't plan to use any additional supplemental fertilizers, you probably need to add about 25 to 100 pounds of compost or composted animal manure per 100 square feet. And you generally would put down composted material about 3 weeks before planting. Or you can add it right up to planting time. And you can side dress with composted matter as well at the rate of about 1 pound per square foot. If you do add bulky wastes such as branches, big pine chips, anything bulky or uncomposted is actually going to use up nitrogen during the decomposition process. The microbes utilize nitrogen. And so uncomposted bulky waste, if you use those, it's best to supplement with a natural fertilizer just to make up for that nitrogen deficit during the decomposition process. To prepare the garden, you want to clear weeds and debris, and you definitely want to get your soil tested for pH and nutrients. And it's really good to test it every season just to see where you're at, because you may need to make some adjustments. And I recommend sending your test off to the soil testing lab at the University of Florida. There is a small charge of $10, but they will test for the major nutrients, the secondary nutrients, and micronutrients, as well as your pH. So if your pH is very low, they will give recommendations for liming. That's only if your pH is low. And we'll talk about that in a minute. You can download forms online, print them out. The landscape and vegetable gardening form is what you would use. And you will also get back fertilizer recommendations based on the nutrients that they determined were in your soil. So they will tell you how much nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium to apply to your garden. You'll want to, based on your soil test, well, in any case, you will amend with organic matter and possibly other inputs like lime. So you want to add the organic matter and get it turned under about 3 weeks before planting. And I would caution you about tilling with a mechanical tiller. It's great. It's easy to get the organic matter incorporated. However, tilling can be disruptive to the soil structure and to the microorganisms that you're trying to encourage. It can bring up weed seeds. It can expose the organic matter to the air where it oxidizes. And so it can also, repeated tilling can create a hard pan underneath where you've loosened the soil. It can really create a layer underneath that loose soil that's very hard. If you do need to add lime to your soil, it's best to do it 2 to 3 months before the garden is planted. You would mix it well with the soil and keep it moist. And that way it's going to have the maximum benefit. So a little bit about pH. This is a pH chart. Typically our pHs in Florida run from about 4 to 8, sometimes a little higher or lower. And what you're striving for in a vegetable garden is a pH of around 5.8 to 6.3. So that is where the most nutrients are going to be available for uptake by the plants. And this chart kind of shows you that. If you look at the 6.0 range, and 7 is neutral, anything below 7 is acidic, and anything above 7 is alkaline. So you're striving for a slightly acidic soil, because that's when most of the nutrients are going to be available. As you can see, when you get into lower pHs, you can have deficiencies in nitrogen, potassium, calcium. When you get into the higher pHs on the right-hand side, you often get deficiencies in micronutrients. They get bound up in the soil and they can't be taken up by the plants. So your plants may show iron or manganese deficiencies. If your soil is very alkaline, very high pH, you can add some micronutrients in the form of foliar sprays, but that is kind of a temporary fix, and you wouldn't want to apply micronutrient foliar sprays in the heat of the day. So unfortunately, a high pH is difficult to adjust. It's very difficult to bring down pH. If you have a low pH, you can bring it up to the level that you want using lime, but you would not want to apply lime to a high pH soil. That will just make it worse. So what if you have poor ground soil? If it's very sandy, very low in organic matter, or very high pH, or poor drainage, or nematodes, well, consider growing in a raised bed or grow boxes or earth buckets like shown here. And I see in the chat box that someone's growing in 5-gallon buckets, and that's great. We demonstrate this in our vegetable garden, and certainly it is definitely doable. You would just, use a good quality potting mix in your buckets and some organic fertilizers, and it's a great contained system. The water is in a reservoir down at the bottom, and it's kind of moves up by capillary action into the rest of the soil and taken up by the roots of the plant. So if you're doing a raised bed, you don't want to use treated lumber. Treated lumber has synthetic chemicals in it. They're not as harsh as they used to be. There used to be arsenic and creosote in treated lumber, but these days it's mostly copper. And so it's safer to use for gardens, raised bed gardens, but not in organic gardening. Composting is a great way to use what you have in your yard and recycle it into a very good soil amendment and a natural fertilizer for your garden. You pile it up into a pile. It should be at least 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot for a compost bin or pile. That way enough heat will be generated in the interior to kill off weed seeds and pathogens. And of course, your compost pile is alive. It's got lots of organisms in there working, and so you want to make sure the water and the aeration are necessary. They're necessary components. The moisture level of a compost pile should be about the consistency of a wrung out sponge, not sopping wet, but not dry. and you turn it periodically to aerate it. And it's good to get a thermometer to stick down in the middle of the pile to see what the interior temperature is. And you're aiming for 131 to 170 degrees for at least 3 days. And that's gonna be what's ideal for killing off those pathogens or weed seeds. And when your pile cools off in the middle, that's when you know it's time to turn it. We do have a compost webinar September 28th, so it's the week after this series ends. So I encourage you to attend that because it's a great way of recycling some of your yard waste, kitchen scraps. You use a combination of green and brown materials, and you can even compost using worms. There's worm bins of all kinds where you can put your kitchen scraps and come out with a nice fertilizer that you can add to potting mixes, put around your trees and shrubs. So I highly encourage composting. If you are working with elderly or children in school gardens, you probably want to look for a compost that you know was processed according to standards that are set out by the EPA. And there is a certification on compost that will assure you that it has been composted to the proper temperature and standards to make sure that it's pathogen free. You can use your compost in potting mixes for starting veggies, and I just put in a kind of do-it-yourself mix. If you want to use things like perlite or vermiculite, which help lighten the mix, perlite is the white particles that you see in potting mixes. It's a natural product of volcanic rock that's been superheated. Same with vermiculite, they are approved for organic use. You would want to add some peat moss or aged pine bark, not necessarily fresh pine bark, because remember, that's going to use up nitrogen as it decomposes. Dolomite can add, that's lime basically, that can add calcium and magnesium to important macronutrients. And it can adjust the pH. If you're using peat moss, that can be very acidic, so lime can help bring up that to a more higher pH. And some natural fertilizers include blood and bone meal, green sand. These would add things like nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, and potassium. And if you are growing a lot, or you want to sanitize your pots or your benches, these are solutions that are approved in organic use as well. These are not for food or food surfaces, but for your tools, bleach, alcohol, hydrogen peroxide, or vinegar. Vinegar is not as effective against all pathogens, but it's very safe. So let's talk a little bit about planting. You can plant in rows or blocks. Blocks are often used for plants like lettuces that you're going along and harvesting big handfuls of it, like baby lettuces, mesclun, spring mix, things like that. You would plant it in a big block. Corn is always planted in a block because you need at least 3 rows of corn in order to get good pollination. But rows are convenient, they're easy to work. they're a straight line. You would just set out a string or a board or a tool rake handle to make a little furrow and plant along the string, and get nice straight rows and spacing that way. You do want to pay attention to spacing of your veggies. Veggies that are too crowded are going to compete with each other for nutrients and sunlight. And so you can plant a little thicker than the spacing allows and then go through and thin out to the proper spacing. And the advantage of that is you don't have to be as careful when you're sowing the seed, but you do have to go back and thin, and you can eat the little seedlings that you pull up. You want to pay attention to the depth that you're planting your seeds or your transplants. Seeds shouldn't be planted more than 2 times the size of the seed in depth. So if you have a big bean seed, you can plant that fairly deep, but a tiny seed like a radish would barely be covered. You would probably just sow it right on top of the soil and then lightly rake over it. You do want to keep your seeds moist when they're germinating. If they dry out, it's really going to stall the germination. So be sure and, give your seeds a light covering and keep them moist. And don't plant your transplants too deep. If you're popping it out of the pot or the cell, check the roots to make sure it has a good root ball, and plant it at the same level as the soil level. There are some that you can plant deep, like tomatoes. The tomatoes grow roots along their stems, so you can really bury that root ball deep, and the roots will grow along the stem and make the plant sturdy and healthier. So that is one that you can plant deep. And you want to think about heights of your plants. Use the step approach, meaning that you would plant your lower growing vegetables in front or on the south side, and your taller vegetables on the north side, so that the taller vegetables aren't shading the lower vegetables. And interplanting is another technique to utilize all the space that you have in your garden. Some crops are very slow growing and some are very fast growing. And so you have a quick harvest time. So you plant them together. In this example, we have carrots and radishes planted at the same time. And the radishes are ready to harvest in about 3 weeks. So you harvest those and you make space for those baby carrots to continue growing in their long growth cycle. So some short growth cycles are things like spinach, arugula, lettuces, turnips, and beets. And they can be interplanted with longer growing vegetables such as onions, celery, tomatoes, or peppers. You can even use herbs and flowers among your veggies. They are often companion plants that benefit your crops. So that's something to add diversity to your garden. And it helps attract beneficial insects and really create almost a little ecosystem. Mulching is great for your garden. It helps reduce weeds and helps prevent erosion. It can keep moisture in the soil around the roots. It moderates the soil temperatures so that, you know, the roots don't get too hot or too cold. And organic mulches improve the soil when they decompose. So it's just another way of adding organic matter. And it covers the soil so that if you do have disease spores in the soil, they're often waterborne diseases. And when water splashes on the soil, it can splash those spores up onto the leaves of the plant. So providing a layer of mulch helps prevent that, disease reaching the plant. A lot of organic materials used for mulch include things like oak leaves, grass clippings, hay, but you want to make sure that there are no weeds in the hay. Oftentimes there's weeds mixed in, so you could get some weed seeds along with hay. Straw might be better, pine straw. Generally about 3 to 4 inches of mulch is recommended, but you do want to keep the mulch away a couple inches from the stems of the plants because you don't want water sitting around the stems. If you have bulky mulch like those big pine nuggets, those are good for the rows of your vegetable garden, but not so much around your plants. You can even add a weed barrier before you, you know, plant your garden. You can add several layers of newspaper or cardboard under there to prevent weed growth. If you use newspaper, you want to avoid the glossy pages. But most newspaper inks today are made of soy, so they're safe to use. I've been talking a little bit about nutrients, and I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of the nutrients that are needed in your gardening. The macronutrients, the nutrients that are used the most by plants, are the 3 down at the bottom: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And our soils tend to be very high in phosphorus. So that's why it's important to have a soil sample done. You may not want to add any phosphorus to your garden. If you're using a raised bed or a bucket or potting mixes, that's different. But in the ground, generally phosphorus is in abundance. It's nitrogen and potassium that you really need to supply the most of. And so that's why you're always adding organic matter. Nitrogen can be very variable in compost and other organic amendments, and it can be released at different rates depending on the temperature or the moisture or the level of microorganisms. So nitrogen is always kind of the limiting nutrient that you are not sure how much you're able to supply. So it's always good to think about maybe some additional supplemental fertilizers that contain nitrogen. Potassium comes from sources such as wood ashes, seaweed, potash, green sand are all sources of potassium. And then there's secondary nutrients that are also important and needed in moderate amounts. That includes calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And calcium and magnesium come from various sources such as marl, dolomite, limestone, gypsum. And generally, micronutrients are needed in very, very small amounts. And most of organic amendments that you apply to the garden will contain a sufficient amount of micronutrients. So let's take a look at the composition of animal manures. Animal manures are some of the best sources of fertilizer for the organic garden. It's always preferable, however, to use composted animal manures as opposed to fresh manures because of the chance of pathogens. If you do use fresh manure, you should incorporate it into the garden 90 to 120 days before your harvest. If the vegetable is in contact with the soil, that's the 120 days before harvest. If it's not in contact with the soil, say a tomato or a pepper, then 90 days before harvest is when you want to incorporate fresh manure. Composted manure is always the best because it's ready to go. Raw manures can burn plants if you plant them too soon after incorporation, or if you just apply it straight on the top, you can burn your plants. Especially manures that are very high in nitrogen, like chicken, sheep, turkey. You want to be careful with those high nitrogen sources. Most of the manures are fairly low in potassium, as you can see. Rabbit manure here is one of the best, and I've heard that it does not burn plants, even though it's very high in nitrogen. You do want to, because of this variability in the nutrient content, you want to be, testing your fertility regularly to see where you're at. Of course, you don't want to use any pet waste or pig also, because there are diseases that can be transferred to humans. And poultry feed in general can be very high in copper and zinc. So that can end up in your manure. So that's something to be careful about. And especially with horses too, you have a lot of litter with the manure, the pine shavings and a lot of bulky uncomposted material. So that's going to affect your nutrient levels as well. Cow manure can have a lot of seeds in it. So that's why, weed seeds that the animals are feeding on that come out in the manure. So that's why it's best to compost your manures too. Another form of manure is green manure or a cover crop. And these are generally plants that are sown from seed in the garden for in the off season when your garden is fallow. Generally, we plant cover crops in the summertime here. And it provides benefit in that it protects the soil from erosion. Also from weeds. Weeds love to move into bare ground. And if you leave your garden fallow and the soil is bare, the weeds are definitely going to move in. So planting a cover crop kind of discourages weeds and it returns nutrients to the soil, especially if you use a cover crop such as the cowpea, which is shown in the bottom picture. It's a legume, a pea that's going to fix nitrogen and return it to the soil. And with cover crops and green manures, if you're going to turn them in, you want to incorporate them into the soil before they flower and fruit. So you're not really growing this crop for a harvest. The plants are at their peak of nutrient holding before they flower and fruit. So you want to incorporate them into the soil for best fertility in the vegetative state. And allow a few weeks of decomposition and breaking down before you resume planting the garden. Just a word about some of these also. Plants like marigolds in the garden can help discourage nematodes. Some of them are repellent to nematodes. So that's important if that's a problem you're dealing with. And buckwheat is a great one. That's in the top photo. It blooms very quickly, and it is a wonderful plant for feeding bees or attracting beneficial insects. And buckwheat grows best, though, not in the cold and not in the heat. So in those transition times between summer and fall planting, or spring, kind of before it's too hot or too cold. You can purchase fertilizers, organic fertilizers. They are natural inputs. They come from plants or animals. Of course, we've talked a lot about compost, and but there's also plant materials like alfalfa meal or soybean meal, which supplies nutrients. In the animal category, fish emulsions, which are generally liquid formulation, seaweed or kelp products, liquid kelp, they come in liquid form, but most of your other nutrients are going to be in a dry form. They can be slow release or fast release depending on the product. And because they tend to be slow release, they are less apt to burn your plants or leach from the soils. But they tend to be a fairly low analysis. This fish emulsion in the container here is a 411. So the numbers on a fertilizer label refer to the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the product. And remember, those are the 3 macronutrients that are needed most by plants. So you want to look at the analysis of those 3 numbers on the label. So because they're low analysis and slow release, it may require larger or more frequent applications. And you do want to stay away from sewage sludge, tankage, or urea products. And you can look for labels on these input products. You might see the OMRI label, the Organic Materials Review Institute. And that means a third-party institute, this organization, has reviewed the products and certified them as suitable according to the national organic standards, which were developed back in the 1990s for organic production. Or you may see this label for organic production on your inputs. And then you know that they are suitable for organic gardening as well. The USDA organic label on the left is used for the outputs from farms. So the produce, the seeds, the plants are labeled USDA organic if they're grown in a certified operation. Here's just a breakdown of some of the fast release and slow release fertilizers. Blood meal, feather meal, bone meal, and these products are byproducts of the livestock industry. So they are formulated into fertilizers. Blood meal is very high in nitrogen, so you have to be careful. It could burn your plants if you use too much of it. And the other ones are fairly low analysis. And so not as apt to burn. The slow release fertilizers include feather meal, compost, cover crops, uncomposted plant material. And some of you may have fertilizer ordinances in your county, but generally vegetable gardens are exempt from fertilizer restrictions. So you can apply nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers all year round, but organic fertilizers are approved for year-round use, even in the landscape. When you apply fertilizers, you generally want to broadcast the fertilizer in the garden prior to planting. So that's going out and scattering your dry or granular fertilizer products. During the season, you can apply fertilizers in During the season, you can apply fertilizers in bands along the sides of the plants. That's called side dressing. And you can do compost or natural fertilizers this way. Or you can do rings around each individual plant. That's a little more labor intensive. And the fourth method here is the drop method. And that's usually used in nurseries where they're fertilizing lots of pots and they just put a scoop in one place. But that is definitely not recommended because that's piling a lot of fertilizer in one spot. Certain roots are going to get it, but the other ones are going to have difficulty finding that fertilizer. And fertilizers, you definitely want to make a trench and put the fertilizer down and then cover it over, so that the fertilizer does not volatilize and perhaps burn the leaves of the plants. Nutrient deficiencies will appear in the appearance of your plants if they are not getting what they need. And it's important to pay attention to where in the plant the deficiencies are showing up. In the old leaves, if you see yellowing leaves or purple spots, that generally indicates it's one of the macro or secondary nutrients, because these nutrients are mobile in the plant. So if the plant is lacking these nutrients, it starts moving them out of the old leaves and placing them in the newer growth. And if you see the deficiencies occurring in the new leaves, it's usually one of these minor nutrients, excuse me, that because these nutrients are not mobile, so they are directed right to the new growth. And if they're not in sufficient supply, then the new growth starts showing the deficiencies. So just to wrap up a little bit, when you're organic gardening, you have, you're trying to create a whole kind of mimicking nature and encouraging an ecosystem aspect to your garden. So it's always important to think about things like biodiversity and not just in your garden, but throughout your yard. And think about the Florida-friendly landscaping principles of conserving water, protecting the waterfront, recycling, mulching, right plant, right place, fertilizing appropriately. All these are resource conservation principles that you definitely want to think about, not only in your vegetable garden, but in your landscape, using low energy inputs, maybe biodegradable pots, or newspaper or cardboard for weed barriers, reusing some of your things that you have around your yard, or your garden for beds, and maybe solar power. Use renewable resources. For example, when you use mulch, use pine or melaleuca, the flora mulch, rather than cypress mulch, which is not sustainable because it's harvested from wetland areas. So it's something you can incorporate into your, not only your vegetable garden, but your landscape. And biodiversity really is important. Some ways to create more diversity as opposed to the monoculture of one crop or one big expanse of lawn. So you can practice crop rotation for biodiversity. You can plant all the spaces and use your garden area efficiently with intercropping and companion plants. You can use native plantings in your yard, which are great for attracting wildlife and beneficial insects. Birds are great pest controllers, lizards, spiders. So encouraging, you know, the entire ecosystem to be in your landscape is a good thing. And some things you can do to attract beneficial insects are to plant plants like nectar plants that have small, shallow flower clusters. Those attract little beneficial wasps. A lot of the beneficial insects as adults, they feed on nectar, and it's the larva that is the good pest controller, the predator or the parasitoid that's going to be attacking those pest insects that you don't want around. And there's a concept called banker plants, where there are certain plants that are host to things like aphids. Milkweeds, for example, have an aphid that gets on them, but that aphid does not get on other plants in your garden. It's specific to the milkweed. So when you have aphids on your milkweed plants, that's bringing in a whole bunch of beneficial aphid eaters like ladybugs and lacewings and syrphid flies. So it's a food bank for your beneficial insects. And then those beneficials spread out, and they're not selective. They feed on any kind of aphid throughout the garden, not just the milkweed aphid. Here's some useful links. Ask IFAS is the repository for all the publications put out by the University of Florida. There's also organic gardening topics and sustainability topics, and some other certification areas. Now I have time for questions. I think, I went well over my time. Let's see, let me look at the chat. Where can you get buckwheat seeds? The only place I have found buckwheat seeds in bulk was from Hancock Seed, which is in Dade City. I have not seen them anywhere else, but I believe you can get a mail order. There's a good seed source, Rare Seeds. Johnny Selected Seeds, I've used them as well. They have a lot of organic. All right, so with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you'll tune in next week for Max Pests and Insects, and the week after that for Veggies for Health. Thanks so much.